My wife thought I wasn't leaving until she arrived and found only silence, the silence of an absence that screamed louder than any argument we'd ever had, louder than all the words she'd thrown into the wind without considering whether they hurt or not. The key was on the table, in the same place where, years ago, our wedding ring had rested. I left a short letter. I didn't need more than that, because my silence had long since spoken for me. Those who love don't test their luck with infidelity. It was the only sentence I wrote with the certainty of someone who finally understood that true love also knows how to leave when it's no longer respected. When she walked in and saw everything empty, when she realized the closets were too spacious, the hangers with too few clothes, the rooms without my presence, she didn't cry. At least, not that day. I know because, if she had, she would have called me. But she didn't. She was proud. Too proud to acknowledge the mistake of having destroyed everything for someone who wasn't even capable of staying when the novelty wore off. She believed what we had was unshakable, that even if I made mistakes, I would stay, that love would blind me. And for a long time, that's exactly what happened. I stayed. I forgave. I gradually became nullified, suffocated by weightless apologies, cold kisses, and the disguised absence of presence. When I realized I was living with a stranger who was still pretending to be my wife, it was too late. Betrayal was no longer a possibility, it was a reality with a smell, a taste, and a name. She betrayed me in silence, with averted glances, with smiles that weren't meant for me, with deleted messages and empty promises. I found out. Not in the cinematic way you see around here. Not with photos, videos, or even snapshots. I found out the cruelest way, realizing that the woman sleeping next to me no longer desired me, that she avoided my eyes, that she hesitated to touch me. I found out when I tried to hug her by surprise in the kitchen and she pulled away as if my touch were uncomfortable. I found out when I saw in the reflection of the bathroom mirror a cell phone vibrating with a name she swore she no longer remembered. And when she lied, looking into my eyes, it was worse than if she had confessed. There I understood that I was no longer loved, and that my heart was being used as a treadmill for another journey. She betrayed me with the confidence of someone who believed I wouldn't leave, who believed an apology, an impromptu dinner, or a night of sex would be enough to erase the pain she left in my chest every day. For weeks, I watched in silence. I didn't confront her. I wanted to see how far she would go. And she went too far. She made empty excuses, saying she needed space, that she was confused, that it was work. I pretended to believe her. But inside, every time she walked out the door telling me, "I'll be back soon," something inside me died. Until one day, I woke up, looked at her sleeping, and felt nothing. No hate, no love. Only exhaustion. An emptiness so profound that it made me get up, calmly pack my bag, leave the letter, and leave without looking back. She tried to continue her affair with her lover, I know. Because people believe that those who cheat are finding something better, stronger, more real. But the truth is, those who cheat are just running away from themselves. Her lover was the opposite of me, impulsive, shallow, opportunistic. And when the taste of the forbidden lost its luster, he did what all of them do, he disappeared. She was alone. Without her lover, without me, without our home, without our history. That's when she came looking for me. She spoke of longing, spoke of regret, said she didn't know what she was doing, that she was lost, that she felt empty. She wrote me letters she herself would never read. She sent me audio recordings of herself crying in the middle of the night. She showed up at the building where I was living. She waited for me outside with flowers and promises. But I had already met someone else. Someone who looked at me as if I were home, not a prison. Someone who didn't need to lie to be by my side. With her, the silence was light. Her presence was calm. Her touch was natural. With her, I understood that love shouldn't hurt, shouldn't be a contest of vanity or pride. I forgave her. The other one. Not to return, but to free my heart. And, on the day we met face to face again, our eyes still heavy with memories, she tried to kiss me. Perhaps she expected my body to react as before, for my heart to race. But all I felt was peace. Peace that I no longer loved the one who hurt me. Peace that I no longer carried the guilt of not having been enough. Peace that I had left at the right time. I pulled away gently. She looked at me as if she saw the end. Because it was the end. She said, "I dream about you every night." I took a deep breath. "I don't even remember your eyes anymore." She broke down. That was it. She was still stuck in what she destroyed. And I was already free. But what she did after that, well, that was what really surprised me. Because sometimes, those who betray can't accept losing. And when the pain hits, some people desperately try to hold on to the past, even if it's too late. It was at that moment that I realized she hadn't just lost our love. She had lost herself. And that's when, the story really began. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize and we never support any kind of betrayal. All stories told are fictional, created with the aim of showing, in a realistic and intense way, how infidelity destroys homes, feelings, and entire lives. The moral is clear: those who cheat may regret it, but they won't always get a second chance. Get ready to hear a story now. Shocking, exciting and unforgettable. The truth hurts, but it needs to be told. They met on an ordinary late afternoon, in a cafe hidden between tall buildings and bustling streets. His name was Daniel, and she was Isabella. Neither of them knew, at that moment, that this seemingly simple encounter would change the course of their lives. He was a discreet man, with a serene gaze that hid storms that had long since been tamed. He worked in architecture, passionate about forms, spaces, and well-placed silences. He lived by observing details most missed: the way someone held a glass, the hesitation of a gesture, the silence between one word and the next. She, on the other hand, was intense. A creative, ambitious publicist, full of ideas pulsing through her mind. She had an easy smile and a presence that lit up any room. Unlike him, she spoke with her hands, her eyes, her entire body. She was the kind of woman everyone noticed when she walked into a room, but few had the courage to approach. Daniel approached. The conversation that day lasted longer than anyone imagined. It began with a comment about the weather and ended with both of them laughing over childhood stories, as if they'd known each other for years. There was no rush. They were building something that felt solid, with the calm of someone who'd made mistakes before and now wanted to get it right. Meetings became frequent, coffees turned into dinners, dinners turned into late nights divided between movies, pillows, and plans. Before they knew it, they were already living together, sharing not only their home but also their lives. Their routine molded itself to each other's presence. Daniel learned to deal with Isabella's impulsiveness, and she came to admire the calm way he balanced everything around him. They had differences, yes. But it was precisely in these that they found their balance. Isabella liked movement, parties with friends, loud music, and people around. Daniel preferred quiet environments, dinners for two, silence after a long day. Over time, they adjusted. He began accepting invitations to events he would have previously avoided, and she learned to respect the moments when he simply wanted to be home, curled up on the couch with a book or watching an old movie. It wasn't immediate. They had arguments, moments when they seemed to speak different languages. But at the end of the day, they chose each other again. They apologized, learned from their mistakes, and moved on. There was love. A love that, even amidst the disagreements, continued to grow. The wedding took place after 3 years together. It was a small ceremony, surrounded only by close friends and family. Daniel didn't want anything grand, and Isabella accepted. She wore a light, flowing dress, without sparkles or fuss. He wore a light gray suit, with a blue handkerchief in the pocket, a gift from his mother. When she walked in, he smiled as if it were the first time he'd seen her. And perhaps, in some way, it was. They exchanged handwritten vows. They promised loyalty, respect, and complicity. They promised to face the changes that time would bring, the good times and the bad, the boredom and the routine. That night, they believed every word. The first months of marriage were like an extension of their courtship. Everything was new and yet familiar. The house, now theirs, gradually molded itself to their life together. Travel photographs, books piled high, glasses forgotten in the sink, notes stuck to the fridge with phrases like, "Don't forget to buy bread," and "I love you." They had a dynamic that worked. They shared tasks, dreams, bills, good days and bad. Daniel remained a calm, methodical man who lost himself in projects and models, but who made a point of leaving her a freshly brewed coffee every morning. Isabella remained agitated, but now seemed more focused, more mature, more of a partner. She liked to show her husband off to her friends like a trophy. She was proud of him. Of the upright, silent, and loyal man she had by her side. But time, with its ability to sculpt imperfections, began to test the contours of their relationship. There wasn't a single moment when things began to change. It was subtle. Small gestures, almost imperceptible absences, shifts in tone. Daniel began working more, involved in a major project that required late nights, tight deadlines, and extreme concentration. Isabella, for her part, immersed herself fully in the frenetic pace of advertising, in events, campaigns, late-night meetings, short trips. The two were busy building futures, but without realizing it, they began to drift apart in the present. Conversations diminished, touch became less frequent. Meals together became rare. Not for lack of love, but for an excess of distractions. Despite this, there were still good times. They laughed at inside jokes, watched TV shows on the couch, exchanged knowing glances. Sometimes, they slept cuddled together as before. But these were spaced moments, interspersed with long silences and busy schedules. Isabella missed the beginning, that version of Daniel who dropped everything to see her, who wrote surprise notes, who improvised breakfasts on random dates. Daniel, for his part, strove to maintain what they had built, even when he felt exhausted. He didn't say it, but he could sense her restlessness. As if something inside her was searching for more, even without knowing what. They even talked about it. One night, after a silly argument about where to have dinner, they sat on the couch and were silent for minutes. Then she said she felt they were different, that maybe it was just a phase. He agreed. He said every couple goes through phases, that the important thing was not to forget what brought them together. They made plans to travel, to reconnect. They tried. They spent a weekend away from it all. The trip was filled with laughter, wine, and beautiful scenery, but upon their return, everyday life took over. And the silence between them returned, thicker than before. Still, there were no constant fights. It wasn't a toxic, aggressive relationship, or one marked by obvious betrayal. It was, in a way, the kind of crisis many couples face. A silent crisis, made up of emotional mismatches, unspoken expectations, and suppressed needs. Daniel continued to love Isabella. He loved the way she fixed her hair when she was nervous, the sound of her laughter when she saw something really silly, the way she invented nicknames for everything. And Isabella, despite the discomfort she felt, still loved the man who made her feel safe, protected, and respected. But deep down, there was something they both avoided facing, the possibility that love alone might not be enough. Daniel believed in stability. He believed that commitment was more important than the bad times, that loyalty was the foundation of everything. He never doubted that he had made the right choice in getting married. He didn't seek excitement outside of marriage, didn't seek validation in other eyes. For him, Isabella was the definitive choice. And so, even in moments when she seemed distant, he remained. He tried to be present, even if he didn't know how to reach her. He was one of those who loved silently, with small actions, without grand gestures, but with depth. Isabella, on the other hand, was driven by intensity. She needed to feel alive, desired, and instigated. She enjoyed challenges, feeling her heart race. And what had once been comfort now felt routine. What had once been stability now felt predictable. She didn't say it out loud, not even to herself. But she felt it. Sometimes she looked at Daniel and wondered if she was still the woman he loved, or just the partner he shared his life with. She couldn't help but admire him, but she was beginning to wonder if that was enough. The days went by. The two of them went about their daily routines, getting through the weeks as if fulfilling commitments. There were still smiles, there was still respect. But something invisible had settled between them. A slowly growing emptiness, fueled by silences and a lack of courage to express their true feelings. Daniel couldn't see everything clearly, but he sensed it. He was afraid to ask questions whose answers he might not want to hear. Isabella, for her part, believed it was just a phase, that everything would return to normal, that it was just the stress of work, that they needed time. And, in that time, something inside her began to change. She started going out more often, spending more time away from home. He said he needed to breathe, that work was demanding. Daniel respected that. It had always been that way. He trusted her. He saw no reason to distrust her. He believed their love was strong enough to withstand the changes. You'd never guess that behind the tired smiles and short hugs, something much deeper was about to happen. And while he made plans to renovate the apartment and breathe new life into it, Isabella made choices that would change everything forever. Choices she herself would later wish she hadn't made. But at that moment, they didn't know it yet. They were still there. Together, under the same roof. Sleeping side by side. Believing, or pretending to believe, that love was enough. That night seemed ordinary, like so many others. Daniel arrived home earlier than usual, exhausted after a day spent cluttered with plans, calculations, and deadlines that disregarded people's time. He found the house silent, the living room light on, but no sign of Isabella. He wasn't immediately concerned. She'd been having a busy week, saying she was involved in a new campaign and would need to work overtime. He believed her. He always had. He left his backpack on the corner of the couch, went to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and grabbed a bottle of water. He looked around. Everything seemed in its place. He wanted to make dinner. He considered making her favorite pasta. But he gave up. Hunger had settled somewhere between the traffic and the disappointment he couldn't name. Isabella arrived late, unannounced. She opened the door with the care of someone who didn't want to wake anyone. She was surprised to see him there, lying on the couch with the television on and his eyes half closed. She smiled as if nothing was out of the ordinary, saying that work had gone on too long, that the meeting was late, that deadlines were overwhelming everyone. Daniel just nodded, pretending to believe in the rush of fate, in the randomness of a cruel routine. But there was something in her gaze that bothered him. Something new. A certain caution not to say too much, a fear of committing himself to his own words. He said nothing. He got up, said goodnight, and went to sleep. But it took him hours to close his eyes. Time passed more densely after that day. Absences became more frequent. Dinners for two were replaced by brief messages and missed encounters. Daniel, even though he wanted to maintain trust, began to notice the signs. Isabella avoided deep conversations, her cell phone was never out of her hand, always on silent, always face down. Hugs lasted less, kisses became automatic. She was nervous, always in a hurry, irritated by the slightest thing. And he, despite the pain that was beginning to germinate in his chest, chose silence. A silence that carried dignity, but also a cowardly fear of discovering what he already sensed. One night, after yet another absence, she came home smelling of something else. A smell that didn't belong in their house, a smell Daniel didn't recognize. She said she'd gone for a drink with a friend from work, that she needed to clear her head. He didn't question her. He just looked. A look that held more words than any conversation could have. She looked away. She went straight to the bathroom. She locked herself in for 20 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were wet, but she blamed it on fatigue, stress, and pressure. Daniel smiled tenderly, without anger, without pressure. And that affected her more than a scandal could have. Amidst the growing distance, he decided to try to recapture what once was. He planned a special evening. He prepared dinner, lit candles, and played the music she used to dance to in happier times. He texted her to come back early. She responded with a hurried emoji, saying she'd try. Daniel waited. The hours passed. The food grew cold. The candles burned down to the end. And when she finally arrived, with a rote apology and a kiss on the forehead, something inside him shattered completely. She noticed the mood and asked if he was angry. He denied it. He just said he was tired. Not from the day. From this. From the space between them. She didn't answer. She went upstairs to her room and fell asleep before him. Daniel remained in the living room for over an hour, silent. Thinking about how painful it is to see someone walk away and not knowing how to pull them back. Thinking about how lonely it is to share your life with someone who no longer shares your dreams. Little by little, the lack of answers was replaced by certainties. He noticed details he'd previously ignored. The different clothes, the smiles she didn't wear at home, the hidden messages she replied to. He no longer needed proof. He felt in his body, in his soul, that there was someone else in the story. But still, he refused to invade, to watch, to search. The truth, however obvious, would only have value if it came to light on its own. Then came the weekend of a mutual friend's wedding. They were both invited. They decided to go together as a way to reconnect. The trip was silent. During the journey, they tried to talk about neutral topics, but the weight of the subtext was always present. At the party, she frequently wandered away, saying she was going to greet someone, that she needed to take care of something on the phone. Daniel stayed with the other guests, maintaining a polite smile as he watched from afar the woman who had once been the most beautiful certainty in his life, now lost in distractions that no longer included him. On the way back, silence filled the car. She slept leaning against the window, he drove with his eyes fixed on the road and his heart given over to memories that were no longer enough. When they got home, they barely looked at each other. She went straight to the shower. He remained in the living room, again. And it was that night, with the sound of water running upstairs, that he decided to open the nightstand drawer. Not to look for anything in particular, but on impulse. Inside, he found an old note, the kind she used to leave in the early years. "You are my peace," it read. Daniel read it and smiled. A bitter, resigned smile. Because in that moment, he knew he was no longer. In the following days, confirmations emerged in details that could no longer be ignored. An unexpected call, a forgotten message on the screen, a name she pretended not to recognize. And yet, he didn't explode. He didn't demand explanations, he didn't ask questions. He simply observed. With the pain of someone who loves and understands they're being abandoned, not brutally, but with disinterest. The betrayal was revealed without fanfare, without scandal. It came as a slow realization, a poison diluted over time. Daniel didn't cry. He felt anger, shame, sadness. But above all, he mourned something that was still alive, but no longer pulsed the same way. He knew that if he spoke, she would deny it. If he demanded it, she would run away. So he decided to say nothing. He began to keep small things. Books, shirts, memories. Little by little, he prepared to leave. Not out of pride, but out of self-love. Because he understood he could no longer fight alone for two. And then, one random night, after a dinner where she'd barely touched her food, he just watched her. She was laughing at something on her phone, distracted, absent-minded. He got up and said he needed to leave for a while. She just nodded. She didn't ask where or why. She didn't realize that this was the beginning of the end. It was that same night that he returned home and wrote the letter. A few lines. Words chosen with surgical precision. There was no hatred. Only goodbye. He placed the ring on the table, next to the key. He packed his bags in silence. He left before dawn. And she would only realize it hours later, when she arrived home to find the emptiness. But what she would do after that, was something Daniel couldn't yet imagine. And what would come next, would change everything. The voicemail arrived 2 months after her departure. There was no name, just an unfamiliar number. Daniel listened for the first second and immediately recognized the tone of her breathing before she even said a word. He deleted it. He didn't respond. She persisted a week later with another message, this time in writing, long, fragmented, full of rushed sentences and words that tried to sound firm but begged for a response. He didn't respond. He had already said goodbye. He continued rebuilding his life cautiously, unhurriedly, supported by the lightness of no longer carrying the weight of a mistreated love. Little by little, he began filling the space around him with peace. He had found someone who didn't make him doubt his own presence. Someone who didn't compare him, who didn't demand unattainable versions, who simply looked at him with truth. Isabella tried to pretend to the world that she was fine. On social media, she posted smiles, motivational quotes, and coffee alone with captions about freedom and starting over. But inside her, the sound of the door closing that last night still echoed like thunder. He wasn't sleeping well anymore. The silence in the house now bothered her. It was no longer rest, it was absence. The details of their time together returned in torturous lapses, the coffee left on the table, the t-shirt folded on the corner of the bed, the deep voice wishing her good night even on days when they barely spoke. She realized now that none of it was small. And the more time passed, the more she realized it wasn't just longing. It was guilt. One morning, after days of struggling with her dignity, she decided to look for him. She waited outside the building where she knew he now lived. She wasn't sure if he would still be there, but it was her last attempt. When she saw him crossing the street, her heart raced. He didn't seem surprised. He simply stood in front of her, with the calm, weary look of someone who already knew the plot. She swallowed the tears that threatened to well up. She said she needed to talk. He hesitated for a second, but eventually let her. They went to a nearby cafe. She spoke slowly, as if each sentence were a tightrope. She said she had no excuses, that she just wanted to be heard. Daniel kept her gaze fixed on him, without interrupting. She said she'd made mistakes, that she'd let herself be carried away by a fleeting illusion, that she'd believed she was missing out by being too static. That, deep down, the problem wasn't him. It was her. It always had been. She confessed that she tried to stay with the other man after the separation, but that he discarded her with the same coldness she'd felt when she'd left her own husband. He said he'd tasted the bitter taste of indifference and that, for the first time, he understood the pain he'd caused. Daniel took a deep breath. He said he already knew. That he didn't need an explanation. That the betrayal wasn't just physical, but emotional. That it wasn't just about the other man, but about all the times she'd chosen to be anywhere but there. She cried. She said she knew, that she was just trying to reclaim the only true thing she'd ever had. When silence fell between them, he stood up. He said there was no hatred. Just weariness. That she had missed her chance to try while he was still trying. Not anymore. She despaired. She asked him to hear just one more thing. And there, in front of the man who had been her husband, she decided to tell him what she had never revealed to anyone. With a trembling voice, she said there was something he might need to know. Something that completely changed the way she saw everything after he left. He said that, weeks after the breakup, in a fit of pain and regret, he decided to seek solace in one of his few remaining friends. He was falling apart, his life in ruins, and he called an old friend, someone who had frequented his house when they were still married. Someone who had always been there. They went for a drink, to talk, she just wanted to distract herself. But throughout the night, amidst venting and unresolved memories, this friend revealed something that made her nearly vomit with nervousness. He confessed that the man she had been involved with, her lover, had made a bet with him months earlier. A stupid, cruel bet, that he could take her away from her husband. That he would win her over only through challenge. He said that, to her lover, she had never been more than a whim, a trophy to be displayed in front of a winning bet. That there had never been any feelings. Only manipulation. Isabella felt invaded, humiliated, used. And worst of all, she realized she had betrayed the only man who truly loved her to live a lie created by someone else's vanity. Daniel didn't react immediately. He maintained his posture, but his eyes grew heavy. This was more than I expected to hear. He didn't ask anything. He just stared at the floor for long seconds. When he finally looked up, he asked if she knew about the bet while they were still together. She vehemently denied it. She said she only found out later, that if she had known earlier, she might not have had the courage to even look at herself in the mirror. She spent weeks trying to understand how she could have thrown everything away for someone so shallow. And now, seeing Daniel with another woman, living in peace, she realized she had lost more than one marriage. She had lost her own identity. Daniel then said, in a firmer voice than he had ever used with her, that the problem wasn't the lover. It never was. That the real mistake was hers, for allowing herself to be carried away by vanity, for not recognizing the value of the one who loved her deeply. He said that, deep down, what hurt most wasn't the betrayal, but the certainty that she knew what she was doing and still chose to leave. That love demands daily choices, and she chose to stay away for so long that, when she decided to return, he was long gone. She cried as if trying to expel the guilt through her mouth. She tried to touch his hand. She begged him not to leave her with that burden alone. But Daniel just stood up. He said he couldn't carry her pain too. That he had learned to love himself in the silence of the solitude she left behind. And that now, he was with someone who chose him every day. Without a doubt. Without vanity. Without bets. She sat there, crying softly, as if even crying was too late. She realized that no apology would be able to erase what she'd destroyed. It wasn't just the marriage. It was the admiration, the trust, the history. She'd lost everything for something that wasn't even true. And now, she saw clearly, there was no going back. That night, Daniel returned home. He was greeted with a calm hug, a sincere look, a true home. And it was there, in that silent moment, that he understood, true love doesn't scream. It leaves when it's no longer cared for. But there was still something left to happen. Something she would do, something that would change everything once again. 2 days after that conversation at the cafe, Daniel received an unexpected message. It was short, cold, almost matter-of-fact. I need to give you something that's still yours. Can I do it in person? He considered ignoring it, but decided to respond. Not for her, but for him. He wanted closure, completely. He arranged to meet at a park where they used to walk on Sundays, not out of nostalgia, but because he knew there was enough space, physical and emotional, to end anything with dignity. The day was overcast, the sky a shade of gray that seemed to mirror what remained between them. Isabella arrived wearing a coat he remembered well. One she wore on cold nights, when they still sat side by side on the sofa without needing to say anything. She carried a small bag and an envelope. She approached hesitantly, as if bearing the weight of every wrong choice. She handed him the bag without a word, but didn't hold out the envelope. They sat in silence on one of the wooden benches near the walking path. He thanked her for the contents of the bag and prepared to say goodbye, when she said there was still one thing missing. He took the envelope from his bag with trembling hands. There's something here I've never had the courage to show you. It's not an attempt to justify myself. It's simply a truth that belongs to you too. He took the envelope, unopened, and simply nodded. I was about to put it away and move on, but she insisted. Read it now. Please. There was something in her tone that sounded more like a plea than an insistence. Carefully, he tore open the side of the envelope and pulled out what appeared to be a handwritten letter, on pages already creased at the edges. The handwriting was hers, but there was something about it that seemed to come from another Isabella. One he might never have fully known. The reading began slowly, and within the first few lines, her expression changed. She had written that letter weeks before he left home, when they were still together. It was a private outpouring, a silent plea for help that never came. She spoke of an internal pain she couldn't explain, a constant restlessness, a feeling that she had lost herself. She described a loneliness that arose even beside him, even in their shared bed, even on the mornings they shared coffee. She said she didn't know how or when, but something inside her had collapsed, and that everything she did from then on was a desperate attempt to find herself again. The letter was confusing, raw, and painful. It wasn't a justification for the betrayal, she didn't mention that directly, but there was an anguish that cried out for help. Daniel finished reading, his hands clutching the pages. He took a deep breath, and when he looked up, she was staring at him with tears that wouldn't fall. He said she'd kept that letter because, deep down, she knew it was too late, that she'd crossed the line. That she knew he deserved more than that tangle of insecurities she called a soul. I wasn't even loyal to myself, she said, her voice thin. And I ended up destroying the only thing that kept me going. He didn't answer right away. He was digesting it. He felt a kind of sad compassion, a silent lament for everything that could have been different, but also an immutable certainty that there was no more room for them. You didn't trust me with your pain. You chose to lose yourself alone. And you lost me with it, he said, without anger. Just with a mature melancholy. She then confessed what still needed to be said, what Daniel could never have imagined. She said that, weeks before he left home, her lover had begun to distance himself, treating her with contempt, as someone who had fulfilled a role and was now expendable. She said she tried to insist, that she tried to make him see in her what Daniel saw, but he just laughed. He said he was no longer interested, that the bet was over, and that now she was just another mistake. And then, with teary eyes, she revealed that she had even begged for attention. That she had humiliated herself, that she had lost what little pride she had left. That when she realized how low she had become, she understood that she wasn't just a woman cheating on her husband. She was someone who no longer knew what dignity meant. Daniel fell silent. The wind rustled the leaves around him, and the sound of distracted runners' footsteps created a soundtrack that contrasted with the weight of the moment. He stood up slowly. He put the letter back in the envelope and stared at her for several long seconds. You didn't just lose me, Isabella. You lost yourself. And that's what hurts the most to see. She didn't try to stop him from leaving. She just wept silently. She stood there on the bench, watching him walk away with the same calm with which he always walked toward everything he loved. In the days that followed, she tried to rebuild herself. She sought therapy, distanced herself from social media, and cut ties with people who reminded her of choices she'd rather forget. She began writing. She tried to transform her pain into words, as a form of belated redemption. She no longer sought out Daniel. She understood he was in another life, with another woman, with other plans. But deep down, she harbored a secret hope that, one day, she might at least regain his admiration, his respect. She knew the love was gone. But there was still something to be saved. Perhaps herself. Daniel, for his part, went through a different process. In silence, he healed his scars with time and care. The woman he was now with understood him gently. She knew when to speak and when to simply remain. She didn't ask about the past out of morbid curiosity. She simply accepted it as part of the path that led him to her. He didn't talk much about what he had experienced, but he held everything close. He had learned to look back without anger, but with firmness. He knew that the peace he now had wasn't just luck. It was the result of difficult choices. Like leaving, even though he loved. Like not returning, even though he forgave. A year after that last meeting in the park, Daniel received an unexpected invitation. To a local art exhibition where, among the independent artists, Isabella would be present. She was now using a different surname, signing only her first name and an initial. Curious, and without telling anyone, he went. Not for her, but for himself. He wanted to see how far she had gone with the pain she chose to transform. Arriving there, he saw a series of paintings and short, handwritten texts, all addressing the themes of absence, reconstruction, guilt, and hope. On one of the panels, a sentence, "When I lost what I loved most, I realized that what was left of me needed to be rebuilt with what was left." There was no signature. But he knew. She saw him from afar. She didn't go over to him. She just watched, with teary eyes and a small smile of gratitude. Daniel, noticing, gave a curt nod. And then he turned, walking toward the exit. In that moment, there was no more pain. Only memory. And even though everything was in place, there was still one final piece that fate insisted on moving. Something that, even after so much, still needed to happen. And it would be more unexpected than anything the two had ever faced. Daniel left the gallery with the firm steps of someone who knew there was nothing left to bind him to the past, but his heart still stirred by everything those images and words had rekindled. It wasn't about love, nor was it about longing. It was about humanity. For the first time since the end, he saw Isabella not as the woman who betrayed him, but as a person who, despite having destroyed everything they had, was trying, somehow, to rise from the ashes of her own mistakes. And there, in that small gesture of silent recognition between them, there was more closure than any letter, conversation, or argument could ever have provided. There was dignity in the way she didn't try to reach out, and there was compassion in the way he didn't ignore her. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to his usual routine. He divided his days between work, books, walks, and moments spent with his new partner, who offered him a love without noise, without hidden demands, without the weight of an unresolved past. It was still too early to call it a definitive future, but he no longer needed to protect himself with suspicions, nor remain silent for fear of being misunderstood. Everything flowed naturally, as if he had finally been embraced by a peace that came not from the other, but from his own reconstruction of himself. He still thought about Isabella, but without pain. He thought about everything they had experienced as if observing an old photograph, distant, still, untouchable. Isabella, on the other hand, was experiencing the slower, more solitary process of personal reparation. Since the exhibition, she had begun receiving accolades for her art, but none of them seemed enough to fill the void she had carved for herself. Her nights were still interrupted by memories that surfaced without warning, and sometimes she would wake with his name stuck between her teeth, like a whisper of regret that could no longer be found. The reconstruction of her identity had been a laborious endeavor, and although she no longer sought forgiveness, she yearned for something she couldn't name. She knew his love lay elsewhere, that her chance to be a part of his life was gone, but something inside her still hoped, still longed, still wanted to be seen differently, not by the version she had destroyed, but by the one she was trying to form now, even in ruins. It was in this context that the unexpected happened. Months after their reunion at the gallery, Isabella received a call from an unknown number. She answered with trepidation, and on the other end, a calm but firm female voice introduced itself. It was Daniel's current partner. She spoke neither arrogantly nor ironically. She said she knew who Isabella was, that she was aware of everything that had happened, but that she was calling for a simple reason. She wanted to ask that, out of respect for their rebuilding process, Isabella refrained from further contact. The voice wasn't jealous. It carried only the weariness of someone who had also faced other losses. She said she saw how much Daniel had suffered and that, now that he was finally well, any lingering trace of the past would only drag him back into a pain he no longer deserved to feel. Isabella thanked him. He apologized, even though he hadn't done anything since the exposure. He said he understood, that he would respect it. But when she hung up, she felt the ground disappear from under her feet. For the first time, not because of regret for the betrayal, but because she realized she had been completely replaced. Not as a number, as a presence, but as a memory. She had become a shadow. And even though she no longer wanted that love back, it was then that she understood that the consequence of her choice wasn't just losing someone, it was being forgotten by him. He then began to reflect on the true value of his decisions. On what, in fact, he was seeking when he cheated. He realized it was never the lover, nor the moment, nor the adventure. It was a desperate attempt to escape a dissatisfaction he couldn't even name, a lack he created by sabotaging everything he had. And the moral dilemma imposed itself with all its force: how can someone who has done so much harm become a better person? How can one continue to live with dignity when one is fully aware that one has irreparably hurt the only person who gave one true love? The answer didn't come from outside. And she knew it. She would have to carry the pain as a silent companion, not to martyr herself, but to remind herself daily of what she would choose to do differently, if she could. Daniel, in turn, experienced an unexpected situation with his new partner. During a quiet conversation at home, she revealed that she was afraid of becoming merely the cure for a wounded heart. She maturely stated that she didn't want to compete with memories, that she wanted to be chosen not only for the peace she offered, but for the woman she was. Daniel listened in silence, reflected, and then, with the calm of someone who has suffered too much, affirmed that he chose her completely, not as compensation, but as a free choice. He said he was fully aware of what he had lost, but that it in no way diminished the value of what he had now. That he didn't live by comparing, but by learning. And that with her, everything was new. Not because the past was erased, but because he could finally live without having to run from it. This conversation redefined their relationship. They began to build an even stronger foundation, unafraid to talk about their shadows, unafraid to admit their vulnerabilities. They both understood that love wasn't a straight line, but a series of paths that intersect, get lost, and find each other again. And Daniel no longer carried resentment. Only lessons learned. Isabella, upon learning from acquaintances that Daniel was okay, allowed herself to smile, even with tears in her eyes. Not because she still wanted him, but because, at least, she was certain she hadn't completely destroyed his life. Knowing he had rebuilt her happiness helped her cope with her own ruin. And even though they could never share a conversation again, she felt, somehow, that he had freed her the day he didn't forgive her to return, but to let her leave with what remained of her dignity. Months later, on a winter afternoon, Isabella received an anonymous package at home. It was a hardcover book about art and emotional pain. Inside was a simple, unsigned dedication: pain only becomes a scar when we accept that it's part of the skin, not the soul. She held the book to her chest for long minutes in silence. I didn't need to know who sent it. I knew enough. That was a final point. Definitive. And even though remnants of what once was remained, now there was something more important: the awareness of what would never be again. Meanwhile, Daniel was observing the world with new eyes. He had started traveling again, exploring places he'd only dreamed of before. By his side, a woman who didn't complete him, but overwhelmed him. Someone who reminded him daily that love shouldn't be a constant struggle to deserve, but a safe space to exist. And even though Isabella's memory surfaced occasionally, it was just that, a memory. Without weight, without pain, without longing. But even when everything seemed resolved, an unexpected event approached. A coincidence of life, or perhaps a final test of fate. Something that would show that, even after so much pain, there was still one more truth to be revealed. And this one, unlike all the others, wouldn't come from words or letters, it would come from an encounter. From a glance. From a detail impossible to ignore. It was a typical late afternoon, one of those when the wind brings a strange chill even under a clear sky, that Daniel, without any planning, entered a small bookstore downtown. It wasn't the kind of place he frequented often, but that day, something drew him there. He walked through the narrow aisles, breathing in the bittersweet smell of old paper and damp wood. He ran his fingers along the spines as if searching for a souvenir, not a book. He stopped in front of a shelf of urban photography, opened a copy, and was surprised to see, in the first pages, a black and white image he recognized immediately. It was an inconspicuous street, with a leaning lamppost next to a flower stand and a glass reflection that, by chance, captured Daniel himself in the background. That photo had been taken without his knowledge, perhaps months ago. In the bottom corner of the image, the signature, I am Rosha. He knew who he was. And his throat closed with an anguish that wasn't sadness, nor pain. It was astonishment. The clerk noticed his altered expression and approached. Daniel cautiously asked if the photographer often came by. The young man confirmed it, saying she delivered copies every month, that she sometimes stayed for hours in that very corner of the bookstore. He thanked her, returned the book to the shelf, and left. He hadn't thought to look for her, but something had stirred inside him. Chance continued to touch his wounds with curious fingers. And even though everything was resolved between them, that portrait wouldn't leave him alone. 2 days later, he received a call from his brother, inviting him to a family lunch. It was his niece's birthday, and the house would be full. He brought his new companion, who was already a part of family gatherings, having integrated naturally and effortlessly. Lunch was flowing with laughter and childhood stories when, stepping out to breathe in the garden, Daniel spotted a woman standing on the sidewalk across the street. She wasn't part of the party, nor did it seem like a coincidence. It was Isabella. She was carrying a bag with a package, hesitant, clearly nervous. He crossed the street. The two stared at each other for a few seconds that felt like minutes. She smiled sadly and said she'd heard about her niece's birthday from a mutual friend. She didn't want to intrude or cause discomfort. She simply wanted to leave a gift, as a discreet way of keeping a good memory alive, even from afar. Daniel thanked her with a look. There was no more room for long conversations there. He picked up the bag and, before returning, asked if she was okay. She hesitated, but answered honestly, "I'm trying to become someone who no longer destroys what they love." He nodded and said goodbye. He returned to the party, gave his sister the gift, without elaborating. But for the rest of the afternoon, that sentence reverberated in his head with the weight of something still unfinished. The next day, Daniel's partner commented on the woman she'd seen on the sidewalk. She asked casually if it was her, his ex. He confirmed it. She didn't show any jealousy. She simply mused quietly, "There are people who spend their lives trying to get things right after making too many mistakes. But some wounds don't heal because they keep being touched." He didn't answer. He felt like the wound no longer hurt, but it still existed. And even without bleeding, the scar still throbbed after a few days. A few weeks later, Daniel received a job offer in another city, far away. It involved a sustainable housing project, something he'd dreamed of for years. His new partner, upon hearing about it, immediately supported him. She said she could continue her work remotely and didn't mind the change. But before accepting, Daniel felt he needed to end the cycle once and for all. Not for her, nor for himself. But because he didn't want to carry any echoes of the past into this new chapter. He arranged a meeting with Isabella. He proposed coffee in a neutral place, far from everything they knew. She accepted without hesitation. She arrived punctually, wearing something simple, almost unpretentious, as if she already knew this wasn't a reunion, but a final farewell. Daniel was direct. He said he was leaving. That he was accepting a new challenge, in another city, that he would start over again, with courage and truth. She smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. She said she knew this would happen. That it was inevitable. The city was too small for two people who carried so much unresolved history. The conversation flowed smoothly, without demands, without attempts. Isabella explained that she would start teaching photography at a local school, that she was writing a book of visual chronicles, that she had learned to live alone, and that, for the first time, she was at peace with loneliness. Before they said goodbye, Daniel said he forgave her. Not just the betrayal, but all the times she hid from him, all the times she pretended everything was fine when it wasn't. He forgave even the things she never knew. She cried silently. Then she said he was the greatest love she had ever known. And that, even though she had lost him, that love had shaped her. You broke me when you left me, but it was exactly that cut that made me see who I was. He smiled empathetically. He said that, in a way, they were both alive inside again. Not like before, not together, but free. The embrace was brief, firm, and without promises. And then, each went their separate ways. In the following days, Daniel finalized the moving preparations, packing not only objects, but also memories. He took few belongings, leaving behind everything that no longer made sense. His new life would begin lightly, as it should. There was no longer any guilt, no pain, no resentment. Only the certainty that he had survived what had nearly destroyed him. Meanwhile, Isabella walked the streets as if she finally belonged to herself. She had stopped hiding behind guilt and failed beginnings. Now, she walked with her head held high, even knowing some doors would never open again. She no longer needed them. She had understood, firsthand, what it means to lose someone because she didn't know how to care. And this would be the guiding light for the choices she would make from then on. But fate, with its ironic precision, still had one last scene in store. Something as subtle as it was definitive. On his last night in the city, his bags packed, Daniel went out for a stroll alone. He stopped in front of a newsstand he always passed by without noticing. Among the forgotten magazines and books, he saw a photo featured on the cover of a local cultural publication. It was him. Or rather, his reflection. The same image from the bookstore, enlarged, with a text beside it, "The moment we don't know we're being seen is the one that most reveals who we are." Beside it, Isabella's full name. He smiled, unsurprised. He bought the magazine, folded it carefully, and put it in his suitcase. There was closure. Not with words, nor reunions, but with art. A record of the past captured by someone who, even in their mistakes, knew how to see the truth. And Daniel understood that, despite everything, there was beauty in what had been experienced. Because even failed loves can transform us profoundly. The next morning, he left. With him, he no longer carried the weight of an end, but the lightness of an absolute new beginning. In the new city, Daniel encountered not only unfamiliar streets but a new rhythm of life. It was as if everything that had come before had been merely a long preparation for what was beginning now. The project that brought him here required not only his technical skill but also the sensitivity to understand what the locals wanted in every line, every wall, every space. The work occupied a good part of his days, but it wasn't an escape. It was a true surrender. In his spare time, he explored small cafes, book fairs, and quiet woods. He had found a kind of inner balance, the kind of peace that only comes after surviving a love that crumbles. The woman at his side remained present, but without suffocating. She respected his pauses, embraced his silences, and walked beside him as if demanding no place, but rather a part of every space. She was the opposite of the restlessness that had marked him for so many years. And with her, Daniel learned that love isn't about intensity that burns, but about constancy that warms. Isabella, meanwhile, continued her solitary journey toward reconstruction. Life didn't forgive her easily. No matter how hard she tried to move on, echoes kept resurfacing. Some friendships were lost along the way, others endured with effort. Her emotionally distant parents tried to support her as best they could, but her mother's resentment was clear, not for the choices she'd made, but for everything Isabella had destroyed out of pride. Even so, she persisted. She taught with passion, teaching her students to see the world through lenses that captured emotions, not just images. And, in each class, she poured a little of the sensitivity she herself had taken years to discover. Her photographs began to gain space in small exhibitions, until a prestigious gallery invited her to present a solo show. It was her chance to establish herself as an artist. She spent sleepless nights preparing the paintings, choosing each shot as if telling chapters of a story no one knew, but that everyone would experience firsthand. And among the images on display was a series entitled, What Love Doesn't See. They were silent portraits of absent faces, empty spaces, shadows against the light. And in the center of the gallery, the only painting with anyone visible, Daniel, captured from behind, at the exact moment he entered that bookstore months ago. The caption simply read, "The moment he no longer belonged to me." The exhibition was a success. Critics praised the emotional depth, the delicate narrative, the pain transformed into art. But for Isabella, the recognition was mixed with an irreparable emptiness. Because none of it brought back what she truly lost. She was where she wanted to be professionally, but with no one to share her achievements with. The audience applauded, but the silence in the house when she returned was deafening. At night, lying in an oversized bed, she remembered details that had previously seemed insignificant, the way Daniel rolled up his shirt sleeve, the sound of the door closing slowly so as not to wake her, the notes left on the refrigerator with crooked handwriting. None of these memories hurt violently. They hurt subtly. Because it was in the details that she had lost herself, and it was also there that she understood, too late, the value of everything she had. A year after Daniel moved away, Isabella learned from a mutual friend that he had gotten married. There was no grand ceremony, no invitations distributed. It was an intimate affair, between close friends and family. The wedding wasn't announced on social media, it didn't make the news. But it happened. And upon learning this, Isabella didn't cry. She didn't scream, she didn't rage. She sat on the sofa, hugged her knees, and remained silent. It was a silence that hurt, yes, but also brought closure. Because in that moment, she knew with absolute clarity that everything that could have been, was no longer. That the love she received with loyalty and dedication had found a new home, and that she, by letting him slip away, had paved the way for another woman to love him as he deserved. And though this broke her insides, it also offered her one final gift, the naked, raw, and non-negotiable truth that betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person, it destroys the best in the person who commits it. Daniel, now married, was living peaceful days. His new wife was a soul mate, someone who had learned from her own pain and, therefore, recognized the value of loyalty. Together, they built a home where the past wasn't taboo, but neither was it the protagonist. They spoke openly about the traumas they carried, about the failures they experienced before meeting each other. And it was precisely this honesty that united them. One Sunday afternoon, while watering the plants on the balcony, he confessed that it had taken him a long time to allow himself to be loved again. He said he had become skeptical of love. She looked at him tenderly and replied, "I didn't come to convince you to love again. I came to walk by your side until you felt like trying." Daniel smiled, and for the first time in a long time, he understood that it was possible to be happy without fear of losing everything again. Because now he knew the value of every gesture, and he surrendered himself consciously, no longer naively. Isabella continued writing. Her texts, published in magazine columns, began to attract loyal readers. She wrote about human relationships, about mistakes, about new beginnings. She spoke with the frankness of someone who had made too many mistakes and had to reinvent herself to avoid falling apart completely. She never named anyone, never exposed anyone. But in each text, there was a delicately woven pain, a sincere attempt to pass on the lesson she had learned from her own blood. Loving someone takes courage, but remaining loyal requires character. She received messages from readers who said they had changed their attitude after reading her words, people who had reversed impulsive decisions, who had asked for forgiveness, who had chosen more consciously. And, somehow, this healed her a little inside. Still, she knew that no matter how much she wrote, she would never regain what she had lost. But perhaps, by helping others avoid making the same mistake, she could transform her guilt into purpose. Time passed. Daniel and his wife decided to adopt a child. The process was long, full of emotional stages, visits, and interviews. But in the end, they held in their arms a little girl with curious eyes and a shy smile. And in that moment, Daniel understood that everything he had experienced, the pain, the loss, the betrayal, had prepared him for that moment. The pain had not been in vain. It had taught him to recognize the value of pure love, of silent commitment, of the gesture that speaks louder than any promise. Isabella, upon learning of her adoption, wrote a text she never published. She kept it to herself. In it, she said, "Losing someone who loves you is like dropping a crystal glass and trying to pick up the shards with your bare hands. You bleed, cut your fingers, and in the end, you're still left with the feeling you could have held on better. Today, I've learned to carefully handle everything that comes into my life. Because I know what it's like to see something break and be unable to fix it." This story is about choices. About the small, everyday betrayals, those that begin with averted glances, unspoken words, presences that become absences without warning. It's about how betrayal often doesn't begin with the act itself, but with negligence, with a lack of care for the other person and the relationship. Daniel moved on, not out of revenge, but out of self-love. Isabella stayed, not as punishment, but as a consequence. And in the end, both learned that life exacts with surgical precision every decision made without conscience. If you've made it this far, comment now, what would you have done in Daniel's place? And in Isabella's place? Your opinion is important, leave it in the comments. And of course, if you were moved by this story and want to hear more stories like it, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This really helps our work continue to grow. And before we conclude, a thought: betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It erodes respect, kills love, erases admiration, and leaves invisible scars that not even time can completely heal. No one cheats by accident, and no one comes away unscathed. Every choice has a price, and some cost beyond repair. This channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Our stories here exist to show that loyalty is a choice, and that those who don't choose to love right often end up learning too late the value of having been loved.